The Shred Druid is a super fun mid-game build, but how does it fare in the late game? Let's talk about it. Starting with the skills that kills, we have my favorite melee skill for druids, which is Storm Strike. Now, normally I would go into Fierce Storm Strike because that was one of your main sources of vulnerable with other druid builds, but the Shred Druid has a lot of various ways to make things vulnerable. So we don't do that. Instead, we have those 2 points down there. On the next part of the tree, we obviously max out Shred and we go with Primal Shred. Primal Shred is what makes us blitz around the battlefield like a Twisting Blades rogue, but we're not. We're actually a druid, and it's a ton of fun. I really do love this build. Let's keep going. The passives in this tree, we're going to go with 1 into Heart of the Wild so that we can get 3 into Wild Impulses, and this is going to make our stuff cost more rage, but it's going to do more damage. The other passives are 3 into Predatory Instincts, because this is going to give us a lot more crit chance, and then we have Digimon, and this is completely maxed out, and we have a really high roll on our boots to kind of give us even more run speed. It's kind of crazy. And honestly, you couldn't pay me enough to figure out how to say this. Digitigrade Gate. Anyhoozle, on the next tree, we have Blood Howl, and the rune that we go for with that one is the one that's going to give us more attack speed. That's very important to this build. We'll go over that in the stats section, but you absolutely need this. And then we have 3 into Fortitude, which is going to give us a bunch of all resistances. 15% is kind of crazy. And then 3 into Vigilance. And this is the one that gives us damage reduction every time we use something like Blood Howl, for example. Now, some variants of this build do use Debilitating Roar, but we lean very heavily into the Shepherd's aspect, and thus we want all the minions, and so that's up next. For the minion section, obviously, we have 1 point into all of them just so we can benefit from Shepherds. So we have Brutal Ravens because it gives us another one. The one that we have with Poison Creeper is actually going to give us more crit chance against things that are affected by our Poison Creeper. And lastly, we have the Ferocious Wolf Pack, which is going to give them a chance to fortify us every time they attack. On the following tree, we are a werewolf build. So we have 1 into Neurotoxin, 1 into Toxic Claws, which is going to apply the poison for us. And then obviously we max out Envenom, which is going to give us more crit damage against poison targets. On the ultimate tree, there are a few ways to do this one. I personally ran this, not what you see on screen. This is what's recommended for everybody else, which is running Lacerate. But I run this as a Shred build with the full amount of minions so that I get the maximum effect from Shepherds. So the last few points can finish Quick Shift for us and Thick Hide instead of going with Lacerate. So again, I don't use an ultimate for this one. You can if you want to, but the way that I play it is just barely different. Those 3 points go into those couple passives instead. Now for the key passive, this is kind of important. Normally you'd think you would go with Ferocity because it's going to give you that guaranteed crit and then all the crit damage. But honestly, this build has so much critical strike chance already that it's just better to go with Ursine's Strength instead. This is going to give us that flat damage boost that we need throughout the entirety of this build, and we're healthy most of the time anyway, so this is pretty important because most of our other passives, which we're about to go over, do everything they can to keep us alive. And by passives, I obviously mean Spirit Boons, and they look a little bit like this. We have Wariness, which is going to give us damage reduction against elites, and then we have Iron Feather for more maximum life, and then Avian Wrath for more critical strike damage. Bolster is going to give us even more Fortify every time we use Blood Howl, our defensive skill. And then finally, Masochistic is going to give our critical hits a chance to heal us for a good portion of our health. And if you were paying attention earlier, this build has a ton of crit chance. So this happens pretty goddamn often. Now for the aspects of this build, obviously the first one that we always are going to go for on most Druid builds, at least I think, should be Shepherds, which is going to give us bonus damage for each minion that we have that's active on the field. And the other one is Stampede, which is going to give us even more minions, so that goes hand in hand with Shepherds. Another big one for this build is going to be Unsatiated, which is going to give us more spirit per kill whenever we're using Shred. And then the main AoE aspect that we use is Stormclaw, because that's going to make all of our critical strikes deal AoE damage around whatever target it is. And then in addition to that, we have Accelerating, which is going to give us bonus attack speed every time we critically strike. For the defensive ones, we have Vigorous, which is going to give us a 15% damage reduction. And then we have Might, which we proc rather often. If you need more resource, you use Storm Strike, and thus you get another 20% damage reduction. And then obviously we have the option to go with Disobedience for more armor if we're not armor capped already. Now speaking of anything regarding stats, in Season 4 they changed the way that all this stuff works. They made it a lot easier to digest for the general public like myself, and they did this by getting rid of a lot of the useless or weird stat lines, stuff like you have to jump on the trampoline and call your dad in order to do bonus damage, and most of the time you can't do that because most of us don't have dads, or at least we say that on the internet, but we really do. But all that aside, the absolute #1 stat that you need on this build, you need crit chance. If we haven't gotten that drilled into your head already, you need critical strike chance. And then a very, very close second in priority to that is going to be attack speed, so that we can shred like there's no goddamn tomorrow. Any other offensive stat bonuses that you can think of, feel free to throw them in there, but you absolutely need crit chance and attack speed. As for the defensive ones, you only need life, all res, and bonus armor, baby. I'm pretty sure the defensive stats are the same on every single build that's out there. Now moving on to the Paragon on this build, like everything out there, the Paragon can be kind of daunting and or confusing, and you don't really know where to go or what to put your points into. I like to use max roll as they're one of the most helpful guides out there, but I use it as a guideline and not as a gospel, meaning you and I can put our points however we want to, but what their guide suggests is going to look something like this. On the starting board, we have these nodes taken care of, and then the glyph that we're using is Outmatch, which is going to give us more damage and then bonus damage against non-elites and bosses. And then on the first board, we have Lust for Carnage, which is going to give us spirit regen every time we critical strike with wolf skills. Again, crit chance is extremely important. And then the glyph that we're going to use here is arguably the most important, which is Werewolf. It's going to give us a ton of bonus damage, and then it's going to give us damage reduction. To the left of this, we have the Ancestral Guidance board, and we're not using the glyph socket, but we are using Ancestral Guidance. This is to get us to the next board, and this is going to give us bonus damage almost always because Shred is not a very cheap skill, so we're pretty much going to spend 75 spirit every 5 seconds no matter what we're doing. The board north of this is Heightened Malice, which is actually up here, and what's interesting is we kind of use 2 entrances on this board, which I haven't seen on many other builds kind of at all, and that's going to give us more damage based on how many people are poisoned around us. And then the glyph that we use is Fang and Claw, which is kind of the same. It's going to give us more damage to poison targets. It's also going to give us damage reduction from poison targets, and then we're going to deal extra damage to close enemies, which we're Shred, so that's always. Now the board to the right of this one comes from the first board that we choose and links over here, and that's the Thunderstruck board, which we completely ignore, but we're going for the Territorial glyph, and this is going to give us even more bonus damage to close enemies as well as damage reduction from close enemies. We blaze on through Heightened Malice, going to the Inner Beast board, and the glyph that we're using here is Spirit, and this one probably has to be like right next to Werewolf as one of the most important glyphs you can use because this is going to give you that critical strike damage, and since this build is entirely laid out with crit chance, this is super important. Now as always with every single Paragon board, you can use whatever the hell you want to use. This is just what I'm using to showcase this build. As for the endgame gear, Mad Wolf's Glee is basically the only unique that you're going to need for this entire build, and I think you get one for free from your Iron Wolf quest line, or at least I did. However, it was sacred, so it was still good, but I also just got gifted a 925 from one of my homies, so that's great. But yeah, get Mad Wolf's Glee. It's extremely important. It increases all of your werewolf skills, and it makes Werewolf your true form. Now, the playstyle for this one is kind of similar to the Twisting Blades robe, where you're dashing around the battlefield the whole time. You do have access to all of your summons down at the bottom if you need them, but the main thing that you're doing is just shredding to every single target, and then whenever you're low on resource, you can just Storm Strike to gain some of that back, so that's your basic, which is going to proc Might, giving you damage reduction. Blood Howl can be used as an additional potion, but also gives you that attack speed from the rune that we're using. And then the main chunk of AoE damage that you get is all passive from that Stormclaws aspect, which is going to make you pop things every time you critical strike. So you should be able to handle most packs and bosses without any problems. That being said, objectively speaking, this build is actually very good at AoE clearing and very good at killing bosses, though it is just a little soft when compared to others. I did put this up on the Pit Clapometer, and it scored a kind of decent 5 minutes and 29 seconds, making it not super fast, but also not super slow. The real thing here is that this build is extremely fun to play. And in my personal opinion, I actually very much enjoyed doing this build and doing the video on this build. It reminded me of how much fun a Druid is, so much so that I actually already made one, got it rushed to World Tier 4, and I'm currently leveling it right now. As soon as I'm done with this video, I'm going to be back on my Druid trying to get up to wherever I need to be. I do think, like most classes, this one's pretty slept on. I don't think a lot of people talk about this as much as they should, and I'm going to happily give this build like a 7.9 or no, let's do an 8 out of 10 on this one. Now, I know it's been a couple of weeks since the launch happened, but what are you playing this season in Diablo 4? You'll have to let me know in the comments down below, and on your way down there, maybe like this video and subscribe because they're both free and they really help out the channel here. And if you want, you can catch us live. We try to stream at least once or twice a week here on YouTube, and the best way to stay up to date on what's going on there is join our Discord and pay attention to the announcements tab that's in there. But more importantly, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video, and if you're bored, YouTube is going to recommend this next one for you. Happy grinding, travelers, and we'll see you in Sanctuary.